Well, hello to our Devex audience around the world. I'm Kate Warren, Executive Vice President at Devex, here today to host a conversation with U.S. Representative Chris Stewart on the role of Congress in setting the U.S. global nutrition and food security policy and the prospects for legislation to strengthen U.S. leadership on global nutrition issues. Representative Stewart has long held a strong interest in nutrition issues. In fact, I believe he grew up on a dairy farm in Idaho, and he also serves on the House Appropriations Committee, which of course has an important role in appropriating funding, including for foreign aid. So look forward to hearing his perspective on what the US government is currently doing and can or will be doing to address ending global hunger. First, a big thank you to our sponsor, CARE, for making this conversation possible and for their leadership on this important issue. And thank you, Congressman Stewart, for joining me today. Well, to kick off, you are a congressman representing a district in the state of Utah. So why is international food security and food policy an important issue for you and your constituents?
Well, because we're human, right? This is important for everyone. It's not, as I think we'll elaborate, it's not a Republican or Democratic issue. This is a human issue. And we're at a time when the world is stressed in these kinds of needs. You mentioned I sit on the Appropriations Committee. I also sit on the House Intelligence Committee. And because of that, I've been able to travel all over the world and to some of the world's most desperate places. And when you see people who are living on the edge of starvation nearly all the time, and as a former military officer, having seen that some of the instability that can come because of needs for food or because of a population that just aren't having their basic needs met, including their basic needs in nutrition and food. And there's this old saying, I know you've heard it, but it is when your belly is full, you have 100 problems. But when your belly's not full, when you're hungry, you only have one problem. And that's really true. And if we don't solve that one problem, if we can't help people just to not so they're living in fear of subsistence, of just where do they get their next meal, you can't solve any other problems until you have solved that problem. And I think that's kind of a background of why this has been important to me and to my constituents. I'm very blessed to represent, a district in Utah that our community is very outreaching. A huge percentage of people in Utah have lived overseas. And I don't mean just visit, they've actually lived there and they've seen the conditions that there are around the world. It's given just a great appreciation and a lot of support for these kinds of efforts.
Yeah, you mentioned the crisis in Ukraine. We also have the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a really devastating impact on the world economy, putting the food security and nutrition status of millions of people at risk. We've seen fast rising global food prices, overwhelmed supply chains. Now with this Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I believe between the two countries supplies, I think, a third of the global wheat supply. So the concerns that this conflict will exacerbate what is already really a food crisis around the world, particularly for those that rely on imports or themselves mired in conflict, like in Afghanistan, Yemen, Mozambique, the list unfortunately goes on. What role do you think the US government should or will play in addressing this worsening situation? And what are the dangers if we don't?
Well, that's a very, very broad question. Let me hit a couple points if I could. First, to emphasize the importance of the question, you talk about the pandemic and global food interruptions in global food supplies or just supply chains. UN did a report early in the pandemic that said between 200,000 and 300,000 children would starve to death, directly attributable to interruptions in supply chains. And unfortunately, that proved to be true. Now, a similar study shows similar numbers between 200,000 and 400,000 that will starve to death because of not interruptions in supply chains, but because they just can't afford it any longer. I was talking to a friend of mine. He's a global agricultural consultant, and he works around the world, and he has for his entire career. He's one of the preeminent experts in this area, and he pointed out to me, and I just haven't thought of it this way. When the price of wheat goes from $4 to $8, people who are living on bare subsistence, they don't go to the market and pay $8 for a bushel of wheat. They go to the market and pay $8 or $4 for half a bushel because they don't have the $8. It's not a choice for them. It's not a consumer choice. They're paying everything they have. And if it buys half a bushel or if it buys a bushel, it matters not to them. They only have that much money. And I think those are all illustrations. And so now Kate, to your point about, well, what can Congress do? What can the US government do? I think there's a couple elements to that answer. And one of them may not be, as direct as I think we'll talk about in a minute, but I think it is the beginning as well. And that is, we've got to help to provide for global security. We've got to help the people in Ukraine. We've got to be able to dissuade, military adventurism like we've seen with Vladimir Putin and other potential adversaries around the world. And if we don't do that first, and as painfully obvious, we may have potentially millions of refugees out of Ukraine, and they're going to be fleeing into Eastern and Western Europe and other places. And how do we care for those people? Again, when you have instability now, the price of grain, as you've remarked, Kate, partly because of limiting exports from Russia and Ukraine, but also because of the price of energy makes it more difficult. That's going to have enormous repercussions throughout Africa, throughout Malaysia, throughout other nations around the world. So I think, that's one of the primary things we can do. And after that, there are specific, acts that we can support. And one of the most important is we come up in the next reauthorization of, for example, the Global Food Security Act. We've worked with some of our partners on that for several years. That's critical. The new farm bill that will come up for reauthorization next year, as we encourage U.S. agriculture and as we encourage exports and making those agricultural products available globally. I mean, those are, I think, a sampling of some of the things that the U.S. Congress and U.S. government can be involved with.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, some of these issues are interconnected, and as we see playing out right now, food policy, nutrition are so interlinked with other foreign policy issues, global health, trade, security, climate, you name it. What are some of those wider foreign policy issues that a well-funded and well-targeted food policy could help solve? And how do you think about these issues together?
Well, I think, again, it sounds like an oversimplification, but it's really not. I mean, you begin to think about those things by how it impacts your local community, the people that are around us, people we care about. And for example, last week I was at Camp Williams, which is, an army camp in Utah, and we were handing out boxes of food to soldiers, and recognizing that a frightening number of our soldiers who are in the United States military are on food assistance. I think that surprises a lot of people to know that, and so it was a real honor to be there and to hand out for these boxes of food, and we did that for the effort went on for probably 4 hours. So I think one of them is to be reminded, hey, people that people that you associate with every day may be struggling. It's not just people in sub-Saharan Africa. We've got some interest in food security here at home as well. And then after that, Kate, I think some of the programs that that we can support, whether it's the Global Food Security Act, whether it's the Nourish the Future. There's a number of initiatives and again, people that we've worked with who are leading on this, and try to support them again through the appropriations process, make sure that they're adequately funded. And even as a conservative Republican, even someone who's frightened to death about the stratospheric spending that the U.S. government is undertaking right now, I have always and will continue to defend some of the initiatives with global food security. I just think there's a special role there for the U.S. government. We can do more than any other government can. We should do more than any other government. We need to lead on this, and if we don't lead, then who will? I mean, Vladimir Putin's not going to lead on this. President Xi isn't going to lead on this. And the European nations are always looking to U.S. leadership. So I just think we have a special responsibility. And part of the way we can do that is to fill some of the financial needs. And doing that through the Appropriations Committee is something I just am really, really proud to do, and something that I will always defend.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point, and you talked a little bit about the bipartisan support. And I think foreign aid more broadly and hunger and food security more specifically have long garnered bipartisan support, and even what may feel like very partisan times. How do you see that bipartisan support continuing? And what would you say to your colleagues on both sides of the aisle about the issue and the importance?
Well, and what I'd say, to my colleagues would be much of what I've said so far. So I won't repeat myself, but just to emphasize the importance of U.S. leadership on this. and to emphasize the real need for this. You know, remember back, Kate, you're too young, but I remember clearly, you know, in the 80s when we had, you know, again, just a real catastrophe in several parts of Africa because of either civil war, or drought, and the world and you know, our political culture, our pop culture, you know, we had, you know, people creating songs and other things that just kind of brought us all together, and people recognize, hey, there are people around the world that are starving. Then we went through a period of time where that was just not on people's radar. They just didn't think about it that much. And I think many people thought, well, that problem's solved. You know, we don't have to worry about that. Well, as we all know, it's not solved. And we may be looking at acute pressures now, pressures we haven't seen in a generation. So one of the things we have to do is to just remind people, hey, this is an ongoing concern, and it's going to take much more effort than we've been given it so far. And it's going to be an ongoing effort. And then I think, Kate, the last thing I'd say on that is, again, it's not a red thing, it's not a blue thing. You're exactly right. There's very, very deep partisan differences in Congress right now, but this isn't one of them. And on the Appropriations Committee, you get bipartisan support for these efforts. It's not one party or the other that's supporting it and trying to get, you know, some of their colleagues across the aisle to get on board. Most of us recognize the true need and the true responsibility and the ability of the United States to try and to make an impact on these issues.
Well, and you talk about the US leadership on this, but how can governments around the world work together with the US in ending hunger in the years to come? What would you like to see other governments do, you know, with the US leadership on this issue?
Yeah, so again, speaking broadly, I think the other governments will follow US leadership on these. If we don't lead, it's much more difficult for some of them too. So I think the way they view that is, well, we're going to help you if you guys will show us a way. And when we do, it can really make a difference. I think a more technical or down in the sands kind of answer is as well. And that's breaking down some of the silos, some of the barriers between the different organizations, the NGOs, breaking down some of the barriers between government leaders who may be suspicious of Western efforts. So we've all seen that, where you go into some governments who truly need the help the most, but they're just reluctant to take the help from some Western governments or Western organizations. And I think to break down some of those barriers is one of the things that we need to address as we move forward on this.
Well, you know, we have an audience of global development professionals, humanitarian workers. Any message you want to send to them on the work they're doing on the front lines on these issues?
Well, that's easy. God bless you guys. I mean, you are doing some of the most important work that's being done, you know, anywhere in the world. And many of you, as I've met and talked with you, as I visited, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in South America in some cases, whether it's in some Asian countries, even in Eastern Europe, many of you are working in some very austere circumstances. You're not getting rich doing it. It's not like you join this effort because you think it's going to be, you know, a career path to millions of dollars. And I just want you to know that on the behalf of myself and my constituents, and frankly, just tens of millions of Americans, thank you for what you do. And you may not feel appreciated because much of the work you do is out of sight. But you surely know that many of us appreciate it. And surely you know that the people you're benefiting are very, very grateful. And in many cases, it not only changes their life, it sometimes literally saves their life. And, you know, if I could illustrate that just very quickly, I know we're about out of time, but I was in an African nation a few years ago, and we had provided funding through USAID to you know, enable them to have some very, very simple irrigation systems. I mean, these things were way less sophisticated than most of us have on just to water our lawn. Yet it had such a difference to them. And I remember talking to this young mother and say, you know, what did this mean to you? How did this impact your life? And she said, this means that my children can eat twice a day instead of once a day. And I will never forget that. I mean, most of us, if we miss a single meal, we feel like we're starving to death, right? Like we're gonna pass out before dinner. We don't know what it's like to be hungry. And for us to think about living our lives eating one meal a day, and now we get to eat twice a day. I mean, to you and to everyone you work with, that's the difference you're making. And that's what I would thank you for.
Right. Well, thank you, Congressman Stewart, for your time today and your leadership on these issues. We will continue to follow the issue of U.S. leadership and legislation as it relates to global hunger and nutrition on Devex and through our Devex Dish newsletter. Again, a big thank you to CARE for sponsoring today's conversation to help us shed more light on this important issue, which, as you say, really, it impacts us all, right? So thank you for tuning in. Stay safe, be well, and thank you again, Congressman Stewart.
Thank you.